"Ma'am, we don't need catering help right now," the flight attendant said dismissively as Sarah approached the cockpit. She had no idea the 68-year-old woman in the catering uniform had 15,000 flight hours and had once landed a burning helicopter in a war zone, but she was about to find out. From which city in the world are you watching this story today? If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to Unseen Legends for more tales of hidden heroes walking among us. The Gulfstream G650 climbed smoothly through 35,000 feet over the Rocky Mountains, its twin engines humming with precision engineering. Inside the luxurious cabin, 12 passengers settled into their leather seats for what should have been a routine charter flight from Aspen to Chicago. Among them sat tech billionaire Marcus Chen, venture capitalist Jennifer Walsh, and several other high-profile executives returning from a private investment summit. But the most remarkable person on board wasn't in the cabin at all. Sarah Mitchell pushed her catering cart through the narrow galley, methodically checking meal preparations for the 3-hour flight. At 68, her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, arranging silverware and warming appetizers. Her grey hair was pulled back in a regulation bun beneath her catering company cap, and her uniform bore the simple logo of Summit Catering Services. To the passengers who'd barely glanced her way during boarding, she was invisible, just another service worker ensuring their comfort at 500 miles per hour. They had no idea that Sarah Mitchell had once flown medical evacuation missions in Afghanistan, or that she'd logged more combat flight hours than most military pilots would see in their entire careers. In the cockpit, Captain David Rodriguez adjusted his altitude as they encountered light turbulence over the Continental Divide. At 45, he was experienced but relatively new to charter operations, having spent most of his career flying commercial routes. Beside him, co-pilot Amanda Foster monitored instruments with the careful attention of someone still proving herself in the industry. "Beautiful evening for flying," Rodriguez commented, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of orange and purple. Foster nodded, but something in the instrument panel caught her attention. "David, I'm seeing some fluctuation in hydraulic pressure." Rodriguez glanced at the indicators. The readings were still within normal parameters, but Foster was right to notice the subtle variations. "Probably just altitude adjustment. Let's keep an eye on it." In the galley, Sarah paused in her work. 30 years of military flying had given her an almost supernatural ability to read aircraft through vibration, sound, and subtle changes in flight characteristics. Something felt different about the Gulfstream's performance in the last few minutes. Nothing dramatic, but her experienced senses detected variations that most people would miss entirely. She moved to the small galley window and studied the engine nacelles visible from her position. Everything appeared normal, but that nagging feeling persisted. In her military days, such intuitions had saved lives more than once. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. "We're experiencing some minor turbulence as we cross the mountains. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Sarah noticed the slight tension in his voice. Commercial pilots were trained to sound calm regardless of circumstances, but her trained ear caught the subtle stress markers that indicated something more serious than routine turbulence. In the cockpit, Foster was studying her instruments with growing concern. "David, hydraulic pressure is definitely dropping, and I'm getting intermittent warnings on the backup system." Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken. Hydraulic systems controlled everything from landing gear to flight surfaces. Losing hydraulic pressure at cruise altitude over mountains was every pilot's nightmare scenario. "Run the emergency checklist for hydraulic failure." Foster's hands moved quickly across the instrument panel, following procedures drilled into every commercial pilot. But as she worked through the checklist, more warning lights began illuminating the cockpit like a deadly Christmas tree. "Primary hydraulic system is showing critical pressure loss," she reported, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Backup system is fluctuating between normal and warning levels." Rodriguez felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool cockpit temperature. "Contact Denver Center, declare an emergency, and request immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport." As Foster reached for the radio, a new alarm joined the symphony of warnings filling the cockpit. This one was different, sharper, more urgent. "Oh God," Foster whispered, staring at her instruments. "David, we're losing engine oil pressure on both engines." The words hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. Hydraulic failure was manageable. Engine problems were serious but survivable. But catastrophic oil pressure loss on both engines simultaneously meant they had minutes, perhaps less, before both turbofans seized completely. "Denver Center, this is Gulfstream November 742 Alpha, declaring a mayday," Foster transmitted, her voice cracking slightly. "We have dual engine oil pressure loss and hydraulic system failure, requesting immediate emergency vectors to nearest suitable runway." The response came immediately. "November 742 Alpha, Denver Center, roger your mayday. Nearest suitable airport is Grand Junction Regional, bearing 240 degrees, approximately 85 nautical miles. Descend and maintain flight level 240. Emergency vehicles are being notified. Rodriguez felt his hands trembling as he reached for the controls. 85 miles might as well have been 800. With failing engines and compromised flight controls, they'd be lucky to glide half that distance before running out of altitude. Amanda, get back there and prepare the passengers for emergency landing procedures, he ordered. I'll try to maintain control and squeeze every mile out of this glide. In the cabin, the passengers had noticed the change in engine sound and the aircraft's subtle shift to a steeper descent angle. Conversations died as people strained to interpret sounds that might mean nothing or everything. Sarah Mitchell heard it all. The slightly different harmonic frequency of engines operating under stress, the almost imperceptible change in airflow over the wings as Rodriguez adjusted pitch and power settings, the subtle vibrations that indicated hydraulic pumps working harder than normal. She also heard Foster's hurried footsteps as the co-pilot emerged from the cockpit, her face pale but professionally composed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Foster announced, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties and will be making an unscheduled landing. Please return to your seats immediately and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened." The words were carefully chosen to convey seriousness without inducing panic, but Sarah recognized the terminology. Technical difficulties meant system failures serious enough to threaten the aircraft. Unscheduled landing meant they were in genuine danger. Marcus Chen, the tech billionaire, looked up from his tablet with concern. What kind of technical difficulties? Foster hesitated. Passengers had a right to know the situation, but panic could make a dangerous situation catastrophic. "We're having some issues with our engines and hydraulic systems. The captain is working with air traffic control to get us safely on the ground." Jennifer Walsh, sitting across the aisle, felt her stomach drop. As a former aerospace engineer before moving into venture capital, she understood the implications better than most. Engine problems combined with hydraulic failure meant they were facing a potential catastrophic emergency. "Are we going to crash?" asked another passenger, voicing the fear everyone was feeling. Foster's training kicked in. "The captain is highly experienced, and we're taking all necessary precautions. Please follow all safety instructions and remain calm." But even as she spoke, Foster could hear the engines beginning to surge and fluctuate. They were running out of time faster than anyone had anticipated. Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. She approached Foster with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "Excuse me, but I might be able to help." Foster looked at the elderly catering worker with barely concealed irritation. She had a plane full of panicking passengers and a cockpit crisis to manage. The last thing she needed was well-meaning interference from civilian crew. "Ma'am, please return to your workstation. We have the situation under control." Sarah's grey eyes held Foster's gaze steadily. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made the young co-pilot pause. "Miss, I'm a pilot. I have experience with emergency situations. If your captain needs assistance, I'm qualified to help." Foster stared at the woman in the catering uniform. The suggestion seemed absurd. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but this is a sophisticated aircraft. We need professional pilots." "I am a professional pilot," Sarah said quietly. "Former Army, medical evacuation helicopters, and fixed-wing aircraft. 15,000 flight hours, including combat operations in Afghanistan and Iraq." The matter-of-fact way she stated her credentials gave Foster pause. Military pilots, especially combat veterans, were among the most skilled aviators in the world. But the woman standing before her looked like someone's grandmother in a catering uniform. From the cockpit, Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom with barely controlled urgency. "Amanda, I need you back here now. We're losing both engines faster than anticipated." Foster looked between the cockpit and the woman claiming to be a military pilot. Standard procedure prohibited unauthorized personnel in the cockpit during emergencies, but nothing about this situation was standard. "What aircraft types do you have experience with?" Foster asked quickly. Helicopters include UH-60 Blackhawks, AH-64 Apaches. Fixed wing includes C-130 Hercules, King Air variants, and civilian jets up to regional airline size. I've flown in conditions from desert sandstorms to mountain weather, and I've brought damaged aircraft home more times than I care to remember. Foster made a split-second decision that would save everyone's life. "Come with me." In the cockpit, Rodriguez was fighting a losing battle with controls that became less responsive by the minute. Both engines were now showing critically low oil pressure, and the hydraulic failure meant even basic flight controls required enormous physical effort. "David, we're not going to make Grand Junction," Foster reported as she slid back into her seat. "We need alternatives." "There are no alternatives," Rodriguez replied grimly. "Nearest airfield is Aspen behind us, but we don't have the altitude to turn around. We're committed to dead-stick landing wherever we can find flat ground." That's when Foster spoke words that would haunt Rodriguez for years afterward. "David, there's someone here who might be able to help. She says she's a military pilot with extensive emergency experience." Rodriguez turned to see Sarah Mitchell standing in the cockpit doorway. The absurdity of the situation almost made him laugh. His sophisticated business jet was dying around him, and his co-pilot was suggesting they turn controls over to a catering worker. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but this isn't a training simulation. We're dealing with multiple system failures on a complex aircraft." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes rapidly scanning the instrument panel with the practiced assessment of someone who'd read emergency displays under pressure. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Both engines were essentially dead, hydraulic pressure was nearly zero, and they were descending through 28,000 feet with limited options. "Captain, you're right that this is complex, but complex failures require experience, not just training. You're dealing with dual engine failure and hydraulic loss at altitude over mountainous terrain. In my experience, that means you need every available resource." Something in her tone made Rodriguez pause. This wasn't the nervous offer of an amateur wanting to help. This was the calm assessment of someone who'd faced similar situations before. "What's your recommendation?" he asked, desperate enough to listen. Sarah studied the terrain ahead through the cockpit windows. The GPS display showed they were still 60 miles from Grand Junction, but her experienced eye was already calculating glide ratios and descent rates. They wouldn't make it. First, stop trying for Grand Junction. You don't have the altitude or distance. Second, we need to find an alternative landing site within our glide envelope. Third, we configure for best glide speed and stretch every foot of altitude we have. Rodriguez felt a spark of hope. Her analysis matched his own, but she spoke with the confidence of someone who'd successfully navigated similar crises. There, Sarah pointed to a section of highway visible in the distance. Interstate 70 runs east-west through that valley. If we can reach it, the road is straight for several miles, and wide enough for landing. Foster checked the GPS. That's still 40 miles ahead. 40 miles is doable if we optimize everything perfectly, Sarah replied. But we need to change our approach. You're flying this like a normal aircraft. It's not. It's a glider now, and gliders have different rules. Rodriguez made a decision that would either save their lives or kill them all. "Take the controls." Sarah slid into the right seat as Foster moved aside. Her hands found the yoke with the familiarity of decades of experience. Immediately, she could feel what Rodriguez had been fighting. The aircraft wanted to drop its nose and accelerate into a dangerous dive, while the compromised hydraulics made every control input a physical battle. But Sarah had flown damaged aircraft before. In Afghanistan, she'd brought home helicopters with bullet holes in critical systems and mechanical failures that should have been fatal. The principles were the same. Work with the aircraft's capabilities, not against them. "First thing, we're too fast," she announced, pulling back gently on the yoke. "High speed increases sink rate. We want minimum sink, maximum glide distance." The airspeed indicator showed they were flying nearly 50 knots faster than optimal glide speed. Sarah gradually reduced power on the failing engines and adjusted pitch attitude until they achieved the precise speed that would carry them furthest.
"Amanda, I need you to calculate our exact glide ratio based on current descent rate and ground speed," Sarah instructed. "David, contact Denver Center and advise them we're attempting landing on Interstate 70, approximately 15 miles east of Glenwood Springs." As the two professional pilots worked to support her decisions, Sarah's mind ran through the complex calculations that would determine whether 180 people lived or died. Wind direction, terrain effects, aircraft weight, and a dozen other variables all factored into the equation. "Glide ratio is approximately 12 to 1,000, Foster reported after working through the mathematics. Sarah nodded grimly. "That gives us perhaps 35 miles of forward travel from current altitude. The interstate is 38 miles ahead." The numbers were brutally close. They had perhaps 3 miles of margin for error, assuming perfect conditions and flawless execution. Any mistake, any unexpected problem would put them short of their target. Denver Center, November 742 Alpha, Rodriguez transmitted. "We are attempting emergency landing on Interstate 70 east of Glenwood Springs. Request all traffic be cleared from the highway and emergency vehicles positioned." November 742 Alpha, Denver Center, Roger. "Colorado State Patrol is being notified to clear the highway. Emergency medical and fire rescue are en route to the area." In the passenger cabin, people were beginning to understand the gravity of their situation. The engines had gone silent except for occasional surges, and the aircraft's descent was becoming more pronounced. Several passengers were quietly making phone calls to family members, saying things that sounded suspiciously like goodbye. Jennifer Walsh, with her engineering background, was doing her own calculations based on the aircraft's performance. The numbers weren't encouraging. Marcus Chen had closed his laptop and was staring out the window at the rugged terrain below, perhaps contemplating how his billion-dollar empire might end in a mountain valley. Sarah's hands worked the controls with surgeon-like precision, making tiny adjustments to squeeze every possible foot of glide distance from the crippled aircraft. She'd done this before, but never with so many lives depending on perfect execution. Altitude 18,000 feet. Distance to target 25 miles, Foster called out. The mathematics were working in their favor, but barely. They were on the edge of making it, with no room for error. "There," Sarah pointed ahead. "I can see the highway." Through the windscreen, a ribbon of asphalt was visible cutting through the valley floor. It looked impossibly narrow from their altitude, but Sarah's experienced eye could see it was wide enough for landing if they could reach it.
altitude 12,000 feet, distance 15 miles, Foster reported. They were still in the game, but now came the most dangerous part. Landing a powerless aircraft on a highway required not just reaching the target, but arriving at the right altitude, speed, and configuration for touchdown. Amanda, get back to the cabin and prepare everyone for emergency landing, Sarah instructed. Crash positions, loose objects secured, everything by the book. As Foster left the cockpit, Sarah began configuring the aircraft for landing. Without hydraulic power, she had to manually operate flaps and landing gear, each adjustment requiring careful calculation of its effect on glide performance. Landing gear down will cost us about 2 miles of glide distance, she told Rodriguez. We'll wait until the last possible moment. Altitude 8,000 feet, distance 8 miles, Rodriguez called out. Perfect, they were exactly on profile for their approach. But Sarah knew the hardest part was still ahead. Landing on a highway meant dealing with obstacles that didn't exist at airports: overpasses, light poles, signs, and the possibility of vehicles that hadn't been cleared from their path. I can see the highway clearly now, Rodriguez reported. There's an overpass about 2 miles before our target landing area. Sarah studied the approach path. The overpass would require precise altitude management to clear safely while still having enough height to reach their touchdown point. David, I need you to contact the passengers directly. Tell them we're approaching landing and this is going to feel different from a normal touchdown. No need to sugarcoat it, but keep them calm. Rodriguez keyed the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're beginning our approach for emergency landing. The touchdown may be firmer than normal, but we're in control of the aircraft. Please ensure you're in crash position and remain there until we come to a complete stop. Sarah could see individual cars on the highway now, scattered vehicles that hopefully represented the last traffic before authorities had cleared their landing path. The interstate stretched ahead like a narrow runway, disappearing into the distance. Altitude 4,000 feet, distance 3 miles, Rodriguez called. Time to commit. Sarah lowered the landing gear, feeling the aircraft's glide performance deteriorate as the wheels created drag. Now they were truly committed to landing on the highway ahead, with no possibility of reaching any other option. I need landing flaps now, Sarah announced. Rodriguez worked the manual flap controls, and Sarah felt the aircraft's characteristics change again. More drag, but also more lift at slow speeds. The delicate balance between reaching their target and having the right configuration for landing. Altitude 1,500 feet, distance 1 mile. The highway filled their windscreen now, and Sarah could see it was indeed clear of traffic. Emergency vehicles were positioned along the sides, their flashing lights creating a corridor of safety for their approach. Looking good, Rodriguez breathed. We're going to make it. But Sarah's experienced eye caught something that made her heart skip. Power lines. A set of high-voltage transmission lines crossed the highway just before their intended touchdown point, and they were higher than she'd initially calculated. David, do you see those power lines? Rodriguez squinted ahead and felt his stomach drop. The lines were positioned exactly where they needed to descend through to reach the highway. They were perhaps 50 feet above the road surface, creating a narrow window for approach. Can we clear them? He asked. Sarah ran quick calculations in her head. Their current descent path would take them directly through the power lines about 200 feet before their touchdown point. She had two choices: carry more speed and altitude to clear the lines, which might mean landing too fast, or duck under them, which required precise timing and risked hitting the road short of their target area. We're going under them, she decided. It was a decision that required absolute confidence in her ability to judge distances and descent rates. Too high and they'd hit the power lines. Too low and they'd hit the pavement short of their safe landing zone. Sarah pushed the nose down slightly, trading altitude for the precise descent path that would take them under the power lines and onto the highway beyond. The ground rushed up toward them with terrifying speed. Altitude 200 feet, Rodriguez called, his voice tight with tension. The power lines loomed ahead, a geometric web of cables that would destroy the aircraft if they made contact. Sarah held her descent path steady, trusting decades of experience to guide them through the narrow corridor between death above and death below. They flashed under the power lines with perhaps 10 feet of clearance, close enough that Rodriguez could see the individual insulators on the transmission towers. Clear, he shouted. Now came the landing itself. Highway asphalt rushed toward them at 140 miles per hour, the speed necessary to maintain control without power. Sarah pulled back gently on the yoke, beginning the flare that would transition them from controlled descent to touchdown. Hold on, she called to Rodriguez. The main landing gear touched the asphalt with a jarring impact that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. Sarah fought to keep the nose wheel off the pavement as long as possible, using aerodynamic braking to slow their speed before committing to full ground contact. When the nose wheel finally settled onto the highway, they were still traveling over 100 miles per hour on a road surface never designed for aircraft operations. Sarah applied maximum braking, feeling the wheel brakes heat up as they converted speed into thermal energy. The aircraft rolled down Interstate 70 like the world's most expensive land vehicle, gradually slowing as Sarah worked every available method to reduce their speed.
Emergency vehicles paced them along the shoulder, ready to respond to fire or other complications. Finally, after what seemed like miles but was actually less than a minute, the Gulf Stream rolled to a stop in the middle of the interstate. For several seconds, the only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sirens of approaching emergency vehicles. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez finally announced over the intercom, "welcome to Colorado. We're safely on the ground." The passenger cabin erupted in cheers, tears, and applause. People who'd been preparing to die were suddenly, impossibly alive and safe. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, her hands still on the controls of an aircraft she'd never flown before today. Around her, emergency vehicles were taking positions, but the immediate crisis was over. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly, "I don't know who you are, but you just saved 180 lives." Sarah looked at the highway ahead, where emergency crews were already approaching to assist with passenger evacuation. "I'm just someone who used to fly helicopters," she said simply. But Rodriguez was studying her more carefully now, and details were clicking into place. The way she'd handled the aircraft under impossible conditions, the calm authority in her voice during the crisis, the precise calculation of descent paths and approach angles. "Ma'am, what was your military designation?" Sarah hesitated. For 15 years since leaving the army, she'd lived quietly, working civilian jobs and avoiding attention. But tonight, circumstances had forced her back into the role she'd once filled in the world's most dangerous places. "Chief Warrant Officer for Sarah Mitchell," she said finally, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Rodriguez felt his breath catch. The 160th SAW were the Army's most elite helicopter pilots, the ones who flew the missions no one else could handle. They were legends in military aviation circles. "The Night Stalkers," he whispered. Sarah nodded once. That was a long time ago, but Rodriguez was putting together the full picture now. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment pilots were considered among the most skilled aviators in the world. They flew Special Forces teams into impossible situations, often in weather and terrain that would ground other pilots. "How many combat missions?" he asked. 237, Sarah replied quietly. "Afghanistan, Iraq, and some places that don't officially exist." The number was staggering. Most military pilots would consider 50 combat missions a full career. Sarah had flown nearly 5 times that number, each one a potential death sentence in hostile territory. As emergency crews reached the aircraft and began evacuating passengers, word spread quickly about the catering worker who'd saved their lives. Marcus Chen approached Sarah as she gathered her belongings from the galley. "Ma'am, I understand you're the pilot who brought us down safely." Sarah looked uncomfortable with the attention. "Captain Rodriguez was in command. I just assisted." "That's not what he told the emergency crew," Chen replied. "He said you took control when both engines failed and flew us to safety." Jennifer Walsh joined the conversation, her engineering background allowing her to appreciate the technical achievement. "What you did was impossible. Dead-stick landing on a highway, threading between power lines, bringing 12 people home alive. How do you even calculate those variables?" Sarah shrugged. "You don't calculate them, you feel them. After enough time in dangerous situations, your intuition learns to process information faster than conscious thought." Over the following hours, as investigators arrived and passengers were transported to safety, Sarah's story began to emerge. She'd enlisted in the army at 19, earned her pilot's wings, and volunteered for the most dangerous aviation assignment in the military. For 15 years, she'd flown missions that other pilots considered suicide runs, inserting special forces teams behind enemy lines, extracting wounded soldiers under fire, providing close air support in urban combat zones. Her record included 237 combat missions without a single aircraft loss or crew fatality. She'd been shot down twice, both times managing to auto-rotate her helicopter to survivable crashes that saved her crew. She'd received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Bronze Star with Vindevice, and commendations that remained classified. But in 2008, after her third deployment to Afghanistan, Sarah had made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She'd declined promotion to commissioned officer and left the army, disappearing into civilian life. "Why?" Rodriguez asked as they waited for investigators to complete their preliminary interviews. "You were one of the most skilled pilots in the military. You could have had any assignment you wanted." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching emergency crews secure the aircraft on the highway that had become her unlikely runway. "Because I'd spent 15 years learning to fly in places where people were trying to kill me," she said finally. "I'd brought home special forces teams, evacuated wounded soldiers, supported missions that saved American lives. But I'd also done things, seen things that stay with you forever." She paused, organizing thoughts that were clearly difficult to express. "When you fly combat missions, every decision you make determines who lives and who dies. That responsibility, carried over hundreds of missions, it changes you. I needed to find peace." Rodriguez understood. Many combat veterans struggled with the transition to civilian life, especially those who'd carried life and death responsibility in war zones. "And catering work gave you that peace." Sarah smiled sadly. "For 15 years, I served meals instead of delivering soldiers into combat. I helped people celebrate instead of evacuating them from battlefields. It was quiet work, honest work, work that didn't require anyone to die. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Sarah had left military aviation to escape the life and death responsibilities of combat flying, only to find herself in exactly that situation again at 35,000 feet. But when people needed you tonight, Jennifer Walsh observed, you stepped forward anyway. Sarah nodded, because that's what we do. When people are in danger, and you have the skills to help, you don't walk away. The uniform doesn't matter. The job title doesn't matter. What matters is that someone needs help, and you're capable of providing it. As dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, news crews began arriving to cover the story of the miracle on Interstate 70. The image of a Gulfstream G650 sitting in the middle of a Colorado highway would make international headlines. But the real story was quieter and more profound. For 15 years, Sarah Mitchell had successfully hidden her extraordinary past, content to live as an invisible service worker. She'd found the peace she'd sought after a lifetime of war. Yet when circumstances demanded it, she'd stepped forward once again to do what others couldn't. Not for recognition or glory, but because people needed help, and she possessed the skills to provide it. Marcus Chen, whose companies employed thousands of people, would later establish a scholarship fund for military veterans transitioning to civilian aviation careers. Jennifer Walsh would use her venture capital firm to invest in companies that supported veteran employment programs. Captain Rodriguez would request Sarah as co-pilot for the rest of his career, though she politely declined, preferring to return to her quiet work preparing meals for travelers. The aircraft was eventually removed from Interstate 70 and repaired, but not before the highway landing became part of aviation legend. Pilots would study the emergency landing for years, trying to understand how someone had successfully dead-sticked a business jet onto a mountain highway with zero margin for error. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell received a call from the National Transportation Safety Board. Their investigation had concluded that the dual engine failure was caused by a manufacturing defect that could have affected dozens of similar aircraft. Her emergency landing had not only saved 180 lives, but had identified a safety issue that prevented future tragedies. The NTSB offered her a position as an aviation safety consultant, recognizing that her unique combination of military experience and civilian judgment could help prevent future emergencies. Sarah considered the offer carefully. It would mean leaving the quiet anonymity she'd built over 15 years, but it would also mean using her experience to help others avoid the kind of crisis they'd faced over the Rocky Mountains. She accepted the position, but on one condition: she would work behind the scenes, analyzing incidents and recommending improvements, but she wouldn't become a public figure or media personality. "I've had enough attention for one lifetime," she told the NTSB investigators. "Let me help make flying safer, but let me do it quietly." Today, Sarah Mitchell continues to work in aviation safety, her recommendations helping to prevent emergencies and save lives. Few people know her name or her story, which is exactly how she prefers it. But sometimes, when the evening news reports on aviation accidents that didn't happen, or safety improvements that prevented tragedies, the quiet work of legends like Sarah Mitchell is the reason families stay together and travelers make it home safely. She'd learned something important during that emergency landing over Colorado. You can leave the uniform, but you never really stop serving. The question isn't whether you'll be called upon to use your skills in service of others. The question is whether you'll be ready when that call comes. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are serving your coffee, cleaning your office, or preparing your in-flight meal. They're the quiet ones who never mention their past, never seek recognition, never claim the respect they've earned 100 times over. Sarah Mitchell spent 15 years learning to save lives in the world's most dangerous places, then 15 more years learning to find peace in quiet service. When crisis struck at 35,000 feet, she proved that true legends never really retire. They just wait quietly for the moment when someone needs them to step forward once more. Have you ever discovered that someone ordinary was actually extraordinary? Tell us about it in the comments below. And if this story reminds you to look twice at the quiet people around you, subscribe to Unseen Legends for more tales of hidden heroes, because sometimes the person preparing your meal once landed a helicopter in a war zone, and when the impossible happens, they're exactly who you want beside you in the cockpit. This story is a work of fiction created to honor the spirit of service and the quiet veterans who walk among us. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.